The Sound of Damian Wayne. Written by Magnoliabee. Read to you by Evie is Evil. Chapter 2. Damian glared at his backpack as he heard Alfred call for him to have breakfast. The room had a slight chill, evidence of his window having been cracked open the entire night. It made it more difficult than usual to get out of bed, but he of course prevailed. He sighed, pulled off his pajamas to change, and finally got a good look at himself. Small and angry purple splotches were coloring portions of his skin. The bruising was dark and mottled, appearing much worse than the pain had been. He gingerly touched the one on his shoulder and was surprised at how much it ached. He looked as if he had been in an altercation, and surely that would raise questions he'd be unable to answer. He pulled on a long-sleeved shirt and pants, grateful for once that Gotham Academy required uniforms. At least he had an excuse for covering up so much. Hoodies may very well need to be added to his routine in the meantime at home. Damian didn't have much of a plan for school, and he'd realized that quickly when he'd woken up. School required writing and speaking, two abilities that would prove difficult for him to use. He would have to figure something out, because if his grades slipped, it was possible he'd be benched, and sneaking out to find the woman would likely cause an issue. He made his way down to the dining table, and was oddly grateful to find his father absent. Alfred placed a hearty breakfast of pancakes and fruit in front of him with a smile, and returned to the kitchen. Damian ate carefully, and gave a quick nod to Alfred as an inclination of gratitude before hurrying upstairs to finish getting ready. The car ride was similarly silent, and he was thankful that he usually wasn't very talkative in the mornings anyway. The car window was cold, and he rested his cheek on it, watching his breath fog up the glass. The drive was not so long, and was a simple routine. They always arrive in a window of 7:55 to 8:05, never more or less. The car pulled up to the front, and Damian had to mentally prepare himself to exit. He slipped out of the car with an unspoken thank you and trudged up the steps to his school. The day began without issue. Math class was satisfactory. It seemed the numbers he wrote down didn't register with the spell, but he guessed that this was more likely to be that it could detect he was not transferring pertinent information. This was quickly proven as he attempted to use a number cipher and was rewarded with a new bruise on his side. The spell confused him, the boundaries unexpected and catching him off guard. Science was acceptable, PE was too, as they simply ran a mile, which Damian easily finished before the rest of his unathletic classmates. He leaned on the bleachers as he watched a girl fall over from exertion, his teacher agape as his classmates crowded her panting form. It was an entertaining spectacle, and he caught himself planning to inform Alfred later in the day. He brushed the thought away quickly, but his mood was dampened at this. Even history was fine, seeing as he just chose to not take any notes. He never used them anyway. It was when he reached his English class that problems arose. He bit his cheek as his teacher, Mrs. Briggs, placed a piece of paper and an essay prompt on his desk with a smile. His pencil was sharpened to a dangerous degree as he hovered it over the page. He stared at the sheet as if he could will it to write itself. The worst part was how stupidly easy it would be to write it, if he could. 6th grade was not exactly known for strenuous coursework, as exemplified by the prompt on the paper. Write an argumentative essay on your favorite animal. It was almost insulting to be asked to complete such a task, and he wondered if his peers would truly struggle, replying to such a question. He glanced back at the boy behind him, and watched as he stuck his tongue out as he worked. Damian scoffed as he saw what appeared to be a bead of sweat roll down his forehead. Perhaps he assumed too much of the Neanderthals he was forced to call classmates. He stared at the clock for the entire test period, watching the hands move and tick. It was a painful experience as he listened to others finally set their pencils down, letting out breaths of relief at having finished. All the while he glared at the floor, as he knew what would come. His teacher stepped down each row of seats, picking up the essays with a cheery affectation. Her stack was full, and she smiled as she finally reached Damian. She glanced down to see what he'd produced, and a slight frown appeared on her face. He hadn't even written down his name. He looked away as she gave him a pointed look, one eyebrow raised. She leaned over to his ear. "See me after class," she said quietly, and then she stood up to continue plucking papers from desks. The boy behind him glanced over his shoulder, a confused expression on his face as he realized what must have occurred. "Why didn't you write anything?" he asked, and Damian was pretty sure his name was Cody. "You'll get a 0. He rolled his eyes. It was an irritating statement, less because of the truth in it, and more so the indignity of assuming Damian was unaware of what would happen. He clicked his tongue as he turned his head, wishing to do nothing more than search the city. The woman was no doubt gallivanting about, perhaps having cast a spell to conceal herself. She had no good reason to be in Gotham, and he found it difficult to relax as he wondered who she truly was, what she truly wanted. He reasoned to himself that surely one of the Justice League members would show up. She had seemingly escaped from somewhere, and with such power, there had to be at least someone who would come. He hoped they wouldn't put it off, but knowing the work ethic of his father's colleagues, he had his reservations. The students around him picked up their bags, scurrying off with the approach of the bell. They were herded by the door, something he registered to surely being hazardous in an emergency. But they, as predicted, did not care, and when the bell rang, the usual shoving began as a sort of dam blockage occurred. 20 or so students all trying to leave at once. He tapped his foot as he observed a shadow shrouding his desk. He looked up, finding himself face to face with Mrs. Briggs. In his opinion, she wore too vibrant clothing, as it hurt his eyes to look at. She was a younger teacher than most at Gotham Academy, still bright and hopeful, truly of the mindset that she could morph the youth she worked with into respectable members of society. If she wanted to do that, he figured her odds were better in Arkham. "Damian, is everything all right?" Her voice was careful and sweet, obviously trying to instill trust in him. "I noticed you didn't finish your essay." He didn't start would be a more apt wording, he thought to himself, but he held his tongue. He resigned himself to glaring at her. Surprisingly, she held her ground, not even wavering at his attempts to make her back off. He was hoping to just be punished and allowed to move on with his day, but she wasn't having any of it. "You can always come to me, and I mean that. Do you understand?" Her tone was soft and assertive. It reminded him of his mother in some ways, a thought he quickly dismissed. He nodded lamely and picked up his backpack. Her expression was still stiff, but she let him pack up his things. She finally sighed and looked down at him. "I get it if you're having a bad day. I'm just going to let this go for now, but if there's a next time, there will have to be a talk with the school counselor. I want to help you. That's my job." He blanched at her words. This was a bad situation to be in, so soon after the hex took effect. With his teacher breathing down his neck, it was very possible that he'd be dragged to the counselor's office at some point. Even worse, a call home could be made. It would make things much more complicated if his family were hounding him. They could even fall under the misconception that he was on some sort of communication strike. He threw his bag over his shoulder and walked out, hands shoved in his pockets, as he gave no acknowledgement to his teacher, who still seemed to be fretting if her chewing at her lip didn't give that away. He stomped down the empty hallways and pushed through the main doors. Children surrounded him, whining and laughing as they clambered into their cars. Alfred picked him up after school normally, and was seldom late. Damian searched the line of cars, looking for a familiar license plate. He couldn't help but balk when he saw one that was decidedly not Alfred's. He considered his options before begrudgingly deciding that choosing to walk home would cause unnecessary conflict. He'd rather be prepared to throw insults if it were required. He pushed past one of his oblivious classmates, earning an undignified complaint as he reached the car. He yanked on the vehicle's door and glared when he found it locked. The window rolled down slightly, and he leaned over to scowl at the driver. Tim had an obnoxious grin on his face as he fiddled with the car mirror, blatantly ignoring Damian and making him appear a fool. Damian decided enough was enough and reeled his foot back to unleash a kick on the door. It wasn't enough to dent anything, but Tim jumped slightly and glared at Damian, rolling his eyes as he finally unlocked the door. "Why do you have to kick my car, brat? You hadn't been waiting for even 10 seconds. Tim huffed as Damian shut the door behind him. "Don't look at me like that. I didn't exactly volunteer to pick you up, but Alfred called a favor, so this is for him, not you. Don't get it twisted." It sounded to Damian like he was more trying to convince himself than anything, but unfortunately, he had not much more to say than nothing at all, and so he simply sneered and narrowed his eyes while leaning against the car door as they pulled out of the school's lot. There's a tension in the air that he would not and could not break. Tim seemed to sense it too, as he whistled an off-tune beat as they waited at a red light. Damian could hear him shift in the driver's seat, tugging at his seatbelt. "How was school?" Tim asked hesitantly, as if unsure if that was something he should ask, uncertain if normal siblings had that sort of conversation. Damian was well aware that a thumbs up would not keep any illusions of speech, perhaps irritating Tim even more, and he straightened up as he prepared himself to respond. "Adequate," is all he got out before he felt a large thrum of pain on his chest. There was a sharp burn that only bruises could deal, and he inhaled carefully as Tim nodded his head with an annoyed sigh, unaware of the slight tremor that Damian exhibited as he let his eyes remain looking toward the road. "Yeah, my mission was 2, if you care." Tim looked over his shoulder as he made a turn. "I saw John, actually. We had to crash at Khan's, and he was there. He said to ask you when you wanted to hang out." Damian tutted, shifting in his seat. Why wouldn't John be at his own home? The clarification was unnecessary. Furthermore, he couldn't exactly be good company currently. John could talk his ear off, but even he would get suspicious when Damian failed to make any sharp interjects as he spoke. He hummed in response, and the rest of the car ride back was that same awkward silence. The air was thick and suffocating, and he felt like his hearing was sharpening as his ears desired stimulation. A break from the lack of sound. Tim whistled softly once more to each song that played, and Damian felt himself growing annoyed. He hunched in his seat, staring ahead as the manor finally came into view. He got out of the car quickly, waving to Tim briskly as he returned through the front doors. Normally, he would reside in one of the lounge rooms after school, completing homework out there, but he couldn't risk interaction. He simply walked to his room, his neck prickling as he felt like the paintings were staring, observing. Damian did not like that feeling. He hurried to his room, his backpack stuffed with homework he couldn't do, clicking the door shut to hole himself up in bed. The dinner table was too large, in Damian's opinion. It was never quite full enough to look anything more than depressing, a reminder of how empty the manor truly was. Rooms upon rooms with no owner, no visitors. He suspected it was only kept for his father's hope of one day hosting a family dinner with all of his brothers, specifically Jason. His father loved Jason in an almost idolized fashion, and Cass, with Steph and Barbara, perhaps Kate or Selena or even Lucius. But that day had yet to pass, and so he sat at a 20-seat table set for 3. He stared at his plate, wondering when a reasonable hour of exit would be. Not now, as it had only been 5 minutes, and his food was still warm. But as he glanced up to see his father and Tim staring at computers, mumbling about something to do with Wayne Enterprises, he questioned if he would even be noticed. "I don't know why they're selling." Tim dragged a hand down his face, groaning in annoyance. "They have to know something we don't." Bruce nodded, his hand to his chin as he stared intently at something on Tim's screen. "I'll make a call to Sebastian. He'll have his team looking into this." Bruce sighed and took an absent-minded bite from his food, as if he had just realized it was there, which, in all honesty, was quite possible. Damian recognized the name Sebastian. He was the head of one of the company's larger sectors, which he could not remember. Likely finance, it seemed, but without any context, he was unable to fully piece together what had occurred. Someone was trying to sell what was possibly stock, and that was deemed to be bad. He waited to be told as he looked between the two, for one of them to remember that he was at the table too. Realize they had company and perhaps throw him a bone. Give him something, anything that resembles acknowledgement, and he would be content. Sea bass? He's not going to do anything, Tim snickered at the suggestion. Just go straight to Valerie, his secretary. She'll actually make a call at least. Bruce's lips twitched upward. A small laugh let out that surprised Damian. He couldn't remember the last time he had earned such a gesture, such an affirmation of the value his father placed in the one he spoke with. Sebastian is not that incompetent. Yeah? He had me come all the way down from the office because he insisted we were going bankrupt. Turned out he opened the spreadsheet for our electricity bill. Damian watched the two go back and forth, bantering about people and things he did not know. It was isolating in a way, and he noted that Tim glanced at him, as if waiting for his inevitable interjection. He registered then that perhaps this was on purpose, to ice him out, and make it clear he was not wanted. He had no place at such a large table, too small and unlike the men in suits before him. Brazen was a trait that was expected of him, and he had thought this to be an accepted reality of his. And he wanted to speak up, to question their conversation, this inane man, and why he was still working at Wayne Enterprises, why Valerie was not promoted, why Tim would be willing to come all this way down from his office to listen to an incapable man's words, why Seabass would be an appropriate nickname for Sebastian, why they weren't eating their food, why they had computers out when Alfred always chided them for it, why Damian could not be involved, why he couldn't have a role to fill, why he was left alone and viewed to be happy with this, why was he even there? But he could not ask, and so he stared at his food, drifting off into his head as he planned. The lights in the room dimmed for a second, just enough for Damian to glance upward. They came back almost immediately, and he assumed it was probably a generator surge. He kicked my car when I picked him up, all because I didn't unlock the door quickly enough for His Highness, Tim sneered, and Damian understood this to be targeted at him. He did not know how the conversation had shifted so suddenly, and perhaps it was not sudden, and he had just not been paying attention, but he would not think about that possibility. But it was clear who the culprit was. He lifted his head and raised his nose at Tim. He wanted to rebuke the statement, because he made it sound like Damian had actually dented the car, when that was far from the case. Tim had locked the door as a slight, not by accident, made clear by the thrill he had taken from watching Damian struggle with the handle in front of his peers. "Is that true, Damian?" his father questioned, an exasperated expression on his face. "I'd appreciate it if you were more patient. And don't damage things when you're upset. I swear, you better not try and fight me at next week's Scala. I'm not dealing with that again." Damian could only simmer as his father turned back to his computer, motioning a smug Tim to his screen. The two went back to their conversation, not even glancing up when Damian finally had enough and stood up, taking his plate to the kitchen. "Were you not hungry, Master Damian?" Alfred took the dish from his hands, an inquiring expression plastered on his face. Damian shook his head, and Alfred turned and grabbed a plate, which he practically forced into Damian's hands. "I believe this should hold you over if you get peckish later," Alfred said with a light smile before turning back to the dishes he had been scrubbing. The plate had a few cookies on it and cut up slices of apples. His heart warmed a bit, realizing this meant Alfred had noticed how little he'd eaten. And sure, that was his job at the manor, to ensure the well-being of all Bruce Wayne's many eccentric wards. But it still felt good, and so he let it be. It was 3 days before his next patrol. He'd been banned for a bit from weekday patrols after falling asleep during a math test a month ago. 3 days in which he did not speak. And it stung more than he'd like to admit to realize nobody took note. There was nothing to be said about the silence he inhibited. The long hours he spent without owning his own throat and mouth. the fleeting thoughts and ideas that left him at the same moment they were born, as they had no endpoint. They had the sole purpose of taunting him as they dissipated, and how he tried to hold on to them. The silence of Damian Wayne was to be appreciated and desired. It made sense, of course. He usually traded verbal blows with Tim or even Jason when they saw each other, but that wasn't very often as of late. His father worked long hours, and Alfred did not push him to speak. There was a rationale for it to be as long as it was. No prying questions just yet. If there ever would be any. He feared there would be none. Feared that his state was to be preferred. But for no one to notice? Not even a wayward glance? No whispers around him when they think he's not listening? No proposed intervention? That was a harsh reminder of the weight of his words. Could they have any meaning if no one wanted to hear them? To be berated by such an irritating child as he was? He thought not. This hex, this curse that had befallen him, perhaps was an omen, a warning for who he'd become, of how unwanted he continued to be. He was forging himself into a reprehensible being, and perhaps this quiet was the punishment. He did not know if he desired to embrace it, not until he at the very least tried to talk. Never did he realize how integral his ability to speak was to his person. This quiet was without comfort, without a break. Dick hadn't messaged him either, and he had no obligation to do so. He could be waiting for Damian to reach out. That wouldn't be happening, and so he just accepted that it may be a few weeks before the man showed his face again. He'd gotten into another argument with Bruce, which Damian suspected to be about himself, as no one had told him the reason, and had left in a storm, furious with a threatening look on his face. It was quiet, and he did not enjoy it. His teacher was not helping matters, fawning over him and asking him if he was all right periodically. He gritted his teeth and steeled himself through her chatter. It was unusual how involved she insisted on being in his life, not hers, and he found, embarrassingly, he grew to rather appreciate the attention to some degree when not receiving it elsewhere. Concerningly, the bruises he'd garnered from the spell had remained on his body, not lightening in color or pain for that matter. It would be curious if they weren't such an inconvenience. He had nearly winced when a peer bumped into him in his PE class, knocking into his bruised side with the bony floundering only a 12-year-old could possess. At least the week had finally come to a close. His father had mentioned offhandedly that the witch had yet to make a reappearance. She hadn't shown up on any of the city's cameras. He suspected a spell to be the culprit, and it didn't sound like her finding was a high priority for Bruce. He'd been more focused on planning out a large drug bust. That made sense. The drug bust had been in the works for a couple of months now, with even Jason lending aid through intel and henchmen. The witch hadn't done anything with especially urgent effects. The people she had put under spells had all recovered in only a few hours, and they were working under the assumption she would show herself any day now. They kept a lookout for her, but she was of lesser priority, and Damian understood that well. It was just unfortunate that he could not voice the real weight of her actions. She was not some weak mage, but rather a powerful sorceress. So as Damian pulled on his uniform, careful to avoid putting pressure on any injuries, he knew it would be up to him to keep an eye out. After all, it was on him to correct such an occurrence. Author's notes. I know John and Damian wouldn't have met yet, but I like their dynamic, so I love Tim and Damian. They feel the most like true siblings out of all of them, if that makes any sense. And notes from the reader, I actually really enjoy podficking this series, and I'll probably be editing this chapter on my plane back home for the holidays. And I don't think I'm going to have time to re-record some of these chapters that may have been filmed in a parking lot. So if you hear lots of cars revving their engines, yeah, just blame American traffic. That's just kind of how it is over here. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye!